My name is Henry Sokolski. I run the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center. I want to thank you all for coming. Whenever I see a crowd like this for a topic as wonky as the one we've got, all I can figure is there's repressed demand for hearings. And I hope some staff take that back to their members and say, you know, if you hold a hearing, a lot of people will share. Perhaps there are not enough hearings. In any case, today we wanted to examine the question of whether the U.S. should encourage South Korea and Japan to make plutonium-based fuels. Now, a friend of mine said, you mean acquiesce in? And I said, no, I think what we're doing actually is encouraging. And it's very useful to understand that plutonium is a nuclear explosive material. We don't call it that enough. We lose track of that. But it is. And when I planned this, it was in anticipation of some decisions that I knew would have to be made about now, about what our policy might be in renegotiating a nuclear cooperative agreement with South Korea. I didn't realize that the North Koreans got wind of this and decided to help this all along with a number of threats. But perhaps the turnout was a function slightly of that as well. Now, I did not talk about enrichment, even though Japan does it. And of course, almost for that reason alone, South Korea wants to do it. There is a paper by Frederick McGoldrick and Ms. Kim that was sponsored by the Korean Economic Institute. And since I almost never agree with Fred, I read this with astonishment and said, this is pretty reasonable. He has a section on enrichment, very useful to read. Oh, the mic's on. I can sit down. Thank you very much. Well, we got that much. There's hope. Who knows? Perhaps you will have power. Okay. In any case, Decision Time, U.S.-South Korea Peaceful Nuclear Cooperation, has a section on enrichment, which I think is quite balanced. And it says, you know, lots of opportunities to buy enrichment overseas. Uranco is pretty much up for sale now. Might make more sense just to go directly and do that. It also explains that that's not a great driver of policy, or shouldn't be. I recommend that. There is another paper which we put out, which also we had nothing to do with, by the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, called Bigger Picture, Rethinking Spent Fuel Management in South Korea. And I believe we've been spared. You just get the executive summary. It's quite long. But it explains why reprocessing, spiral reprocessing, which our government has determined is reprocessing, is not a great way to manage fuel. Finally, can't resist, because I'm so proud, there are copies of an occasional working paper we have called Serious Rules for Nuclear Power Without Proliferation. I noticed that, again, people who I don't have the chance to work with actually recommend this, including the current Director for Non-Proliferation Studies at IIS. So if he recommends it, I think we should all read it. Today's program. Oh, look! We should applaud like the Italians when the planes land. Good Lord, thank you for coming. Yes, well, don't be so late next time. Okay.
We should cancel the fire drill.
Yes, well, the fire drill was some time ago, sir. Now, Today we are going to hear from Frank von Hippel and Will Tobey. And I have the pleasure of actually having worked with these people, either in government or out. And they do well in both environments. Frank actually had a serious job in government. He was former assistant director for national security in the Clinton administration's Office of Science and Technology. I ripped him a little because he says one of his areas of research are checks and balances in policymaking for technology. And I noted I didn't know that any checks and balances for that field existed. But he's written books on it, which I find very interesting. Advice and Dissent. Right. Prior to coming to Princeton, he also actually used to be a physicist. You're a recovering physicist. You're a policy physicist. Good luck with that. And he's well regarded. He won the 1993 MacArthur Fellowship in recognition of outstanding contributions in his field of research. And he has a PhD from Oxford. He's going to set the tone for things, and then we get, if you will, someone who has never been heavy metal in his life, but who nonetheless knows a lot about practical policy. I'm talking about Will Tobey. He is a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, and he served as the deputy administrator for defense nuclear nonproliferation at the National Nuclear Security Administration. By the way, how did you get that on a card? That's something. And he points out that he's done service under 3 different administrations, although some might see it as the same administration: Reagan, Bush 1, and Bush 2. Right? Okay. In any case, you served on the NSC, and I have to say, one of the things I always look forward when I work in government is being able to meet with you. And we can have conversations and try to sort things out and think about things. Also, it always was a good lunch. So, we now have PowerPoint. I've stretched everything out. So
Not quite.
Not quite?
Well, anyway, I'll start.
Why don't you start, and perhaps he can catch up.
Yeah. Hopefully you'll post the presentation.
We will post both presentations,
Okay.
for sure.
Well, I got into this business 36 years ago, which happened to be at another time of crisis. At that time, Japan was discussing with the U.S. They're starting up a pilot reprocessing plant. And the debate escalated to the point where Prime Minister Fukuda told President Carter that this is a matter of life or death for Japan to go ahead with this reprocessing program. Now, what I think he was referring to was that Japan could not tolerate being dependent on imported uranium like it was dependent on imported oil. And therefore needed to very quickly deploy breeder reactors, plutonium breeder reactors, which are about 100 times more uranium efficient than the kind of reactors, the water-cooled reactors that we had then, that we have now. Well, it's 36 years later. Japan doesn't have breeder reactors. Japan is dependent on imported uranium. And we're in the middle of another crisis over whether, this time over a matter of life or death for South Korea's nuclear energy sector, because its spent fuel pools are filling up, and we're told that unless there's a reprocessing plant, that they'll have to shut down, and South Korea will lose. I think it's about 30% in the future, 50% of its electricity supply. So I'm just going to give you a little background, and the problem is, of course, the reason it's a crisis, it was a crisis in U.S.-Japan relations, and it is a crisis now in U.S.-South Korean relations, is that plutonium is a nuclear weapons material. So when a non-weapon state wants to separate plutonium, it makes it a virtual nuclear weapon state. Japan today has, in Japan, enough separated plutonium for 1,000 nuclear weapons. And by the IAEA's estimates, it could take on the order of weeks if Japan sort of prepared everything to turn that plutonium, some of that plutonium into nuclear weapons. Now, in fact, Japan has not. Yeah. Okay. Good. So how do we advance it?
Well, that's going to happen soon. Sir, do we have a remote? Oh, you have it. Okay, it's coming. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Japan is a virtual nuclear weapon state. It has been in that. It obviously doesn't want to have. There's major barriers within Japan about turning that virtual weapon status into a real weapon state. They haven't done it for 40 years, and perhaps South Korea wouldn't do it either. But it does make the non-proliferation regime more unstable, and it does make it easier for other countries to claim that they need to reprocess. So we have to look at the arguments being made for reprocessing closely. So let's see, let's see how okay. So I'm going to talk about just a little pedagogical, to the extent you can see that, about plutonium separation and nuclear weapons. Why separating plutonium for non-weapons purposes doesn't make sense, and the cheaper and safer alternative for Japan's, South Korea's, our spent fuel is dry gas storage. So just briefly for background, when fuel goes into a reactor, it's about 4 to 5% enriched U-235. When it comes out, most of the U-235 is gone, and about 1% of the uranium in the fuel has turned into plutonium. But the plutonium is mixed with fission products, fiercely radioactive fission products. And even 50 years after spent fuel has been discharged from a reactor, if you stood next to this is a pressurized water, most common type of fuel assembly kind that they have in South Korea, if you stood next to it for an hour, you get a lethal dose, even after 50 years of cooling. So it's hard to get that plutonium, which is in the spent fuel, which is what makes the so-called once-through fuel cycle, where you don't separate plutonium, proliferation resistant. But if you separate it out, on the right-hand side there, I show a picture from a visit at a Russian reprocessing plant in 1994, where a worker is taking a can of plutonium oxide, the form that results from reprocessing, and obviously not in a high radiation environment. There's very little penetrating radiation coming out of that plutonium. The danger from it is that he might inhale, or somebody might inhale some plutonium oxide. And so he's putting one can inside another can. And there's about 2.5 kilograms of plutonium in that can. So 3 of them is enough for a Nagasaki type weapon. I went to a warehouse there that had 12,000 of those cans at the time. They've got more now. Most reprocessing programs, almost all reprocessing programs in the world were launched to acquire weapons. And in fact, today, of the 31 countries that have nuclear power plants in the world, only 7 are weapon states, but of the 6 countries that have civilian reprocessing programs, 5 are weapon states. Japan is the only exception. And so that's why, as I said, that's the significance of why we really have to think seriously about the implications of South Korea doubling that number to 2. By the way, I am opposed to reprocessing in the weapon states as well. So I don't have anything against non-weapon states. In fact, I'm all for them. Now, I guess I talked about this already. In Japan, Japan has operated that reprocessing plant that they started in the 1970s. They built another one, which there's a picture up there, aerial photo. And in 2011, the Japan's Atomic Energy Commission calculated that this will raise the cost of nuclear power. This building and operating and decommissioning this reprocessing plant will raise the cost of nuclear power in Japan by about $100 billion over the 40-year lifetime of that reprocessing plant. So that's about $2 billion per power plant, which is a good fraction of the cost of what Japan invested in all its nuclear power plants. So why would a country want to do that? Japan argues that, in fact, and it's the same argument that's being made by South Korea now, that its spent fuel pools are filling up. The local jurisdictions won't allow it to expand the on-site storage. Therefore, it has to have an off-site storage, some off-site place to send the spent fuel, the older, cooler spent fuel to, and the only acceptable off-site destination is a reprocessing plant, because a prefecture in Japan, will accept a reprocessing plant because of all the money, all the jobs associated with it, whereas it would not accept just a storage site. Now, South Korea has during this whole length of time that we, since the 70s, has also had an interest in reprocessing. In fact, in the late 1970s, it had a reprocessing program in connection with a nuclear weapons program. They launched a nuclear weapons program when the Nixon and then the Carter administration said that after the Vietnam War, we would withdraw our troops from South Korea. We would withdraw our tactical nuclear weapons from South Korea, and the South Korean government at the time, General Park, the father of the current president, said we better have a bomb, our own bomb, if the U.S. is going to leave us exposed. Well, in fact, the U.S. decided maybe it wouldn't withdraw, and as things settled down. But there has been, in the Korean Atomic Energy Research Institute, a continual interest in reprocessing and also in enrichment. And in fact, in 2004, the IAEA learned that for the previous 20 years, at a laboratory scale, the Korean Atomic Energy Research Institute, KERI, had been conducting experiments with reprocessing and enrichment that it hadn't told the IAEA about. Then in the Bush Bush II administration decided that that in fact power processing, the kind of reprocessing that South Korea, KERI, wants to pursue at the moment is proliferation resistance, and encouraged South Korea, well, why don't you work on that? And in fact, Kerry did. Unfortunately, toward the, that started a debate about whether, in fact, how proliferation-resistant pyroprocessing is. And I was involved in that debate. At the end of toward the end of the Bush administration, they commissioned a study by the national labs, well, how proliferation-resistant is pyroprocessing, and the conclusion was not very. It actually helps against subnational threats, but against a country deciding to misuse pyroprocessing plant to acquire plutonium for weapons. There really was not that much different between pyroprocessing and the Purex reprocessing, which is used in Japan and around the world, which was originally developed to separate plutonium from weapons. Let's see, where are we? Okay, so let's see. Okay, I guess we're stuck. Let's see. Yeah, it's frozen. Let's see whether it's raise it up. Okay. Maybe anyway, the picture I'm looking at shows spent fuel casks. 3 pictures of spent fuel casks. One picture is actually from Fukushima.
There we go.
Okay, there it is. Yeah.
Maybe you should stay there.
In the upper right-hand corner, shows a picture of casks at Fukushima, of which not even many well-informed Japanese were aware that there was spent fuel stored in dry casks at Fukushima. We paid a lot of attention to the spent fuel stored in the pools there, when there was concern about keeping water in the pools, but there was also spent fuel in these casks. In fact, the tsunami actually washed through this area. If you look closely, you can see seaweed on one of those casks. But it was fine, and no worry. So it's obviously a safe alternative to reprocessing. The lower left is how we do spent fuel storage in the US, out in the open. And in fact, those, I think 43 casks there are a lifetime output of the Connecticut Yankee nuclear power plant, which is gone now, decommissioned. All that's left is that spent fuel, which is waiting for a repository to be sited someday. Most other countries don't store casks in the open, they put them in buildings, and that's a picture in the lower right. It shows a building, a thick-walled building with casks inside it in Germany. The next one, thank you. We're actually further down the track that Japan and South Korea are worried about going down than they are. Our pools are full. Basically, all of our pools are full. And so what do? We haven't shut down our nuclear power plants. What we've done is put at each nuclear power plant dry casks. And when there has to be a discharge of hot spent fuel from a reactor into the pool, some older fuel, typically 25 years old fuel, is taken out of the pool and put in dry casks to make room for it. And so you see that we've already got a lot of dry cask storage and are projecting more. I'm one of the people who thinks, in fact, we should pull the spent fuel out sooner than 25 years. Yes, next one, please. That's a strange looking one. Is that, okay. Well, maybe, okay. Anyway, I don't think that shows it, but there was supposed to be a picture of the spent fuel in the pool number 4 at Fukushima Daiichi, the pool that we worried about so much, whether it had water or not. And if you could see it, it's the right slide, but I think there's a Mac PC incompatibility that it doesn't look like from this angle like what I'm looking at. Anyway, the fuel assemblies are each in a box. The reason that they're packed so, they're packed as tightly as in a reactor core, almost as tightly as in a reactor core. So in order to prevent them from going critical in the pool, you put neutron-absorbing plates between the fuel assemblies. The result is, if you lost water, there's no air circulation, and so you're in a much more dangerous situation than if you have them spaced out more without these partitions. So if you in fact took the spent fuel out of the pools after 5 years, then you would have 5 times as much space for each fuel assembly, and you'd have less of a dangerous situation. And in fact, the new chairman of Japan's Nuclear Regulatory Authority is urging the utilities to do this, to install dry cast storage on site for safety reasons, to make the pools safer. So if they did that, then they would of course expand, they would expand the storage, and they would be in a situation like we are, where in fact they can wait until an off-site repository or central storage site becomes available, and they can operate their reactors. This is a picture. Actually, it's never mentioned, but in fact, South Korea already has dry cast storage at 1 out of its 4 nuclear power plants. This power plant is not pressurized water reactors like the other 3. It's heavy water reactors. It has heavy water reactors. They put out about 7 times as much spent fuel on a tonnage basis as pressurized water reactors. So the pools there filled up very quickly, and they had to do something about it or shut it down. So what did they do? They got dry cast storage. That's in that box up there in the upper right-hand corner. You see 7,000 tons of dry cast storage capacity, enough to take all of the spent fuel that's in all the other in the other 3 nuclear power plants. So Kerry, which has really been driving this debate in South Korea, said yes, but we can't do that politically at the other side. Well, in fact, when you talk to the bringing on pyroprocessing on a scale that would keep up with the rate at which South Korea is discharging spent fuel, would, even in Kerry's optimistic, I think, timeline, would take at least 30 years. But the crisis is supposed to be upon us within the next 10 years. So there's the solution actually isn't there. It wouldn't be there in time. What Kerry argues is that, well, but if we said to a site, we're going to build an expensive reprocessing plant in your, I don't know what they call them in South Korea, in your prefecture, they call them in Japan. Would you mind, there's going to be lots of jobs, would you mind if we start by storing spent fuel there now, and then later on we'll build a spent fuel storage? They argue that will work. What they really want now is an R&D program. That's what the Kerry is and the R&D program, the first step, they want to do engineering scale pyroprocessing. That would only process about 10 tons of spent fuel a year, which is negligible on the scale of which South Korea's reactors are discharging spent fuel by 500 tons a year. But it would be significant on a nuclear weapons scale, because they would be separating or making accessible 10 to 20 bombs worth of plutonium a year. In fact, India's nuclear bomb was obtained. The plutonium for India's nuclear bombs for many years was obtained from a facility on that scale. So you can launch a nuclear weapon, in fact, smaller scale. So think this brings me to my conclusions. And so, I say the politics are complicated, but the facts aren't. Reprocessing is costly, dangerous, and destabilizes the non-proliferation regime. Dry cask storage is a cheap and safe alternative. We should be helping South Korea to understand this. In fact, that's the only alternative they have in the foreseeable future. In fact, there's an opportunity to do that now because the South Korean government is just launching a public consultation, they call it a public consensus process on spent fuel management, which begins this month, so that there's, I hope there's some way we can help them get the Korean public, which has been getting all of their information from Kerry so far, pretty much all the that there's an alternative source of information that can be provided. And in the meantime, Japan is reconsidering its nuclear policy in the wake of the Fukushima crisis. I mean, they used to say we can't not go ahead with reprocessing because we'll lose the public confidence. Well, they've lost the public confidence, and so this is an opportunity to really sort of go from an irrational program to a more rational program, and setting a less dangerous example for South Korea and other countries, including Iran, which in fact hasn't yet said that it needs to reprocess. It has an inalienable right to reprocess, but could at any time. Thank you.
Okay. By the way, just a side note, the reference to Rakasho and the picture of Rakasho, quite large, is a facility that may open, depending on policy decisions in Japan, this October. And they have to renegotiate their nuclear cooperative agreement with the United States in 2018. That facility, if it comes online, will produce up to 8 tons of separated plutonium. That is roughly 1,000 to 2,000 bombs worth of plutonium a year. I tried to explain this to someone in state. They said, well, so when do they get that much? I said, no, that's every year. And she said, well, 1,000 to 2,000, how many weapons do we have? I said, you're getting the picture. So the idea that you can separate decisions about Korea from Japan, by the way, they watch one another very carefully. They don't just watch North Korea and China. But lest anyone think you only have to worry about North and South Korea or North and South Korea and Japan, China watches Japan. Heads up. Over to you.
Thank you, Henry. It's a great opportunity to be here. I think the fact that turnout is so robust for this topic shows its importance, and in some senses a bit of a failure. I consider myself a friend of both South Korea and Japan, and the fact that this issue has dragged on so long and has now threatened to become a political issue between the two states, I think is something of a disappointment. Before I start in on my comments regarding reprocessing per se, I wanted to add some context in that vein. I believe that the U.S. alliances with Japan and the ROK are strong and important, and should remain so. The events of the last week or two with the bluster that's been emanating from Pyongyang only underscore the importance, and I would applaud, for example, the administration's efforts to reinforce extended deterrence. I'd also add that spent fuel management is a complex and difficult problem, and some circumspection is justifiable, especially in a country where we've had some trouble resolving our own policy. And finally, I would note that nothing in my comments should be construed as being anti-nuclear power. I believe that nuclear power very likely over the long term must be a part of our energy mix. The only reason I have some skepticism about it in the short term really has to do with economics. I think things like shale gas particularly in the United States, will make it less attractive. But for countries that choose to use nuclear energy as a part of their mix, I think that's just fine. My concern has to do with the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology. So, as I have listened to friends in South Korea articulate the reasons why they might wish to pursue reprocessing, I've heard 5 arguments advanced. Cost and space, and Frank's dealt with some of these, and so I'll go quickly. But cost and space, we have to do something with this fuel. Not in my backyard. It's hard to site a storage plant. Energy independence, technology development, and competitive advantage versus other states that want to engage in international nuclear commerce. I'll go through each one in some detail. So in terms of cost and space, the argument is that we're a small country with lots of people, and our storage repositories are filling up. Almost certainly by 2020 they will be full. That's true. On the other hand, and that reprocessing would allow us to make use of a valuable material. The uranium can be recovered and reused, or if it's turned into MOX fuel, it could be turned into a mixed oxide fuel, which could be used in fast reactors, or even in light water reactors if you pursue the model that Ariba has. Multiple studies have concluded that reprocessing is not economic for the foreseeable future, given uranium prices. Unless the price of uranium reaches $340 a kilogram, it's